Nicholas PICKWOAD si è formato nell'ambito del restauro e della legatoria, è stato allievo anche di Roger Powell, ha diretto un proprio laboratorio di conservazione dal 1977 al 1989, è stato consulente per la conservazione dei libri del National Trust in Gran Bretagna, ha fondato e diretto presso la University of the Arts di Londra il progetto di conservazione della biblioteca del monastero di Santa Caterina nel Sinai e ha rivestito presso la medesima università il ruolo di direttore del Ligatus Research Center, dedicato alla storia della legatura e alla conservazione conseguente delle legature. Molti di noi lo conoscono dal proprio percorso di studi perché insegna storia della legatura a livello internazionale da diversi decenni e su questo tema è autore di decine di pubblicazioni. Please, Nicholas.
Thank you, Melania, and greetings to you all. It is a great pleasure to be back in Cesena. I was here 2 years ago for a brief visit and I'm very happy to be back. And thank you to all the organizers of the conference for inviting me to be here. And I'm now going to take you down something of a rabbit hole, out of which I hope we will emerge at the end. When words fail, the limits of a thesaurus. I have been working for many years with the Legatus Thesaurus, but at a certain point you come up against a brick wall, and that I hope to explore a little. How do I go forward? No, too far. It is a relatively straightforward matter to identify and describe most of the features and components of historical bookbindings, and to do this without much significant disagreement within the community of those interested in such matters, many of whom are here today. When it comes to names for what has been identified, there may be some disagreements, mostly associated with a reluctance to abandon familiar and traditional usages that may no longer serve their purpose. To a large extent, this difficulty has been overcome in the language of binding thesaurus by its structure, the work of Thanasis Velios, centered around the scope notes which describe each single concept, about which there is very little disagreement, which allows different terms to be attached as labels to the concepts, all of which can then be searched to find the desired concept. So your favorite term will still find what you are looking for, we hope. Greater problems, however, can appear when concepts are joined together to create compound terms for whole structures, in order to create a structural typology that will allow bindings to be classified according to type. In these instances, strict logic can clash with received, traditional, familiar, and sometimes tenaciously held ideas, which are often based on inherited descriptive practices and assumptions, and not enough examples observed and recorded. It is with this in mind that I would like this afternoon to look in some detail at one particular type of binding, which came to dominate the commercial bookbinding in the 19th century, commonly known as the case binding, but described in the thesaurus as the adhesive case binding, to differentiate it from lace case and tacketed case bindings from earlier centuries. Adhesive case bindings are bindings in which the cover or case is attached to the book block by adhesive only, and when the case has separate boards, those boards are attached to the book block as part of the case and not to the book block before the cover is added. Where that happens, the book is bound in boards. It is not case bound. And this is a crucial distinction in the use of boards in binding structures, but one that is not always that clear-cut. This was very forcibly brought home to me when a particular binding type, John Newbery's bindings in the vellum manner as he described them in the 18th century, which I had long believed from the absence of any visible evidence of board attachment and their case-like opening characteristics, to be the first adhesive case bindings in the English book trade. And these were conclusively shown by the American researchers Todd Patterson and Graham Patton to have had their boards attached to the outermost end leaves of the sewn book block before the book was covered, something they discovered by partially lifting the paste downs of an example to find out how it was made, not a privilege I was given in many of the libraries I have worked in. It is now clear from the construction of these bindings that they were made in the following manner. You start with a typical small format book block. These books were very often printed for a juvenile audience. Newbery and his partner Carnan dominated the trade in children's books in the 18th century in England. So typically they are small format book blocks. sewn on two flat parchment tape sewing supports, often with a central textile transverse spine lining. And they would have the boards pasted to the end leaves before the book is covered, drawn back a little from the joints of the book block to allow for joint grooves to be formed in the quarter green-stained parchment covers. And whilst the use of green-stained parchment for the quarter spine seems to have been almost universal, the sides might be covered with either marble paper or a dark blue glazed paper. Yep. The resulting cover does of course have many resemblances to a case-type cover, but it is now clear that it was not made in that way and cannot therefore be described as such. And for me, it was yet another lesson in the dangers of letting appearances lead to the wrong conclusion. It is very easy, looking at the outside of books, to fail to understand what is going on inside. And I'm grateful to Patterson and Patton for having brought this to light, and it is by the publication of such discoveries that all our research is advanced. A number of other conclusions that they have drawn, however, I think are more questionable. I have long been interested in the early history of adhesive case binding, the progenitors, if you like, of what was to become the dominant commercial binding from the second quarter of the 19th century. The use of adhesive to attach complete covers to sewn book blocks in fact dates back at least to the 1520s, when covers that would more commonly have been attached by secondary tackets or by lacing sewing support slips through them were adhered either to end leaf guards or comb spine lining extensions, and I've seen 6 of these from the 1520s. In the Germanic world, in the 17th century, one-piece case bindings became more and more common and are found widely across Europe in the 18th century. Here from France with secondary covers of marble paper over primary covers of couched laminate board, and that is a typical combination. Patterson and Patton, however, for some reason which I don't quite understand, find it difficult to accept these as adhesive case bindings, though this presents a difficulty when faced by 2 near-identical bindings, one of which, on the right, has the cover attached by lacing the sewing supports through the cover, thus making it a laced case binding. I think most people will agree with that, leaving us with the example on the left where adhesive alone secures the cover to the book block, which to me, at least, makes it an adhesive case binding, not a lace case binding. And here shown in a drawing around a book block, and here with the case alone. And I would like you now to imagine that the case is cut back to what you might be thought of as what might be thought of as a quarter cover. It's the same formation across the spine and the joints, but it's cut short on the sides. And this turns out to be the central structural feature of what I call the 3-piece case binding, which Patterson and Patton describe as an inboard binding with adhered boards. And this is where the naming of parts, which is the primary purpose of the thesaurus, begins to falter and becomes a matter of interpretation. You have the components, how do they fit together? In what order are they made, and how does that affect your description of the type? To a large extent, it depends on where you're coming from. Patterson and Patton have been doing research on adhered board structures, one of which being the Newbury binding I started with, and taking in the very many early modern Germanic binding structures where the boards were secured to their book blocks by adhering them to elements of the end leaves before the books were covered. And a particularly American take on what looked like bookcloth-covered adhesive case bindings, which in fact turn out to have been bound in boards because the boards were adhered to the outermost end leaves or spine lining extensions before the books were covered. These are extremely uncommon in the United Kingdom, though they can occasionally be found, here revealed in this Edinburgh edition by the spine lining extensions lying under the turn-ins, and therefore of necessity being adhered to and attaching the boards before the book was covered. This, therefore, despite appearances, is a book bound in boards and coming from a completely different structural tradition. Patterson and Patton also claim that what the thesaurus describes as 3-piece adhesive case bindings, known in German as gebrochene Rücken bindings, are also bound in boards because the boards were adhered to the end leaves before the book was covered. But there is an essential structural difference between these bindings and the Newbury bindings in the vellum manner, which is that the spine piece, which lies across and over the spine and joints, and the boards are adhered to the outsides of the extensions during the construction of the book and before the book is covered. The central spine piece therefore comes between the end leaves and the boards and is adhered to both. And this is what I often refer to as the stratigraphy of bindings. You're looking at layers. What layer is on top of what layer is on top of what layer, and in what order must they therefore have been put together? And this is an essential tool in their classification. Let us therefore look at the construction of these bindings, which typically starts, as always, with a sewn, rounded and backed book block, with outside hook end leaves providing stubs on each side of the book block. I've shown the book sewn on flat parchment tapes, though raised and recessed single cords were also frequently used. And the bindings may sometimes also have transverse spine linings and stuck-on end bands. We'll see one of those at the end of my lecture. The spine piece, most often made from a thin, flexible, couched laminate board, thin mill board, is cut to the height of the boards and creased and folded to fit exactly over the backing joints of the book block. And if accurately made, will clip neatly over the joints as it is pushed onto the book block from the spine. At this point, the extensions of the spine piece are adhered to the stubs of the outside hook end leaves. The boards are then adhered to the spine piece extensions, and that part of the end leaf stubs, sewing support slips and spine lining extensions that may extend beyond the width of the spine piece extensions. Significantly, as I mentioned a moment ago in terms of the taxonomy of these bindings, the result is actually a viable book binding, though never in my experience left in this state, as in every case that I have seen, colored or decorated paper was then pasted to the boards and spine piece, molded into the grooves created between the spine edge of the boards and the joints of the book block. On the inside of the boards, the cut edges of the spine piece extensions are almost always clearly visible. It's where the red arrow is pointing. How you describe these bindings depends, I think, entirely on how you categorize this item of the construction, the spine piece. In its conception, it seems to me that the three-piece case was designed to overcome the incompatible dual requirements placed on the one-piece case, to be thick enough to be sufficiently rigid to support the book on the shelf, as on the right, with the risk that it would be too thick when you're opening the book. It becomes almost impossible to open some of these books. And flexible enough to allow easy opening for reading, with the risk that it will break down in use, as on the left. The three-piece case binding provided the answer by breaking the cover at the spine, the meaning of the term, quite literally, gebrochene Rücken, meaning broken back, and inserting the thinner, more flexible spine piece to give the required opening characteristics. To my way of thinking, therefore, coming at the question from its historical predecessor, the one-piece case, the spine piece is part of the case-type cover, albeit a cover that is in part constructed on the book. I've even seen a binding in which the boards were adhered to the outside of a one-piece case, which could be seen as an intermediate step between the one-piece and the fully developed three-piece case, though one has to be very careful about creating family trees in this way because the chronology doesn't necessarily fit. Most importantly, the spine piece covers but is not adhered to the spine of the book block and is adhered to the sides of the book block in a process that is almost identical to casing in, only with what might be seen as a quarter case rather than a full case. Once adhered to the end leaf stubs, it can function as a workable binding, allowing the book block to be opened with a natural hollow back on the spine. The addition of boards after the spine piece is adhered in place completes what I therefore see as the primary cover of this book, making the decorated or colored paper the secondary cover. And I do not see it as bound in boards, as the boards are attached primarily to the spine piece and after the latter has been attached to the end leaves. Patterson and Patton come to the question from the perspective of inboard bindings with adhered boards, and for them, the decorated paper is the primary cover. Now, we're all talking about the same components, but we're attaching different labels to them, and that is where the problem comes. None of us disagree as to the components which make up this binding and how they are assembled, but we do disagree about the interpretation of what they make when they're put together, which is where, to my mind, the stratigraphy of the components becomes so critical, establishing the order in which the components were assembled. My question to Patterson and Patton is, what is the purpose of the spine piece if this is a book bound in boards? If it is not to be considered as an adhesive case binding, do we have to create a new binding type to describe it? And if so, what would we call it? And I have no idea on that one. This may appear to many of you to be a rather abstruse and obscure terminological discussion, better suited to medieval scholasticism than modern book history. And it might be better left to one side were it not for the fact that this binding was phenomenally successful, being produced in vast numbers in the Germanic world, which includes in addition to what is now Germany, Scandinavia, Austria, much of Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and from the late 18th century, England, where it was probably introduced by the many German bookbinders working in England at that time. It was also very popular in France at the same period, where it was called La Reliure Bradel, ascribing to the French bookbinder Alexis Bradel the design of a binding actually developed some 100 years earlier in the Germanic world. As you can see from the screen, it remained in use in France until at least 1918. I'm often asked, when did they stop making a certain type of binding? And the answer is I never have any idea, because we've not yet discovered the last one that was made. But this is 1918, so we've got a peg in the chart, which we can then try and get beyond. I'm sure much later examples will be found. Exactly where and when these bindings were first made remains unknown, but this small Amsterdam edition of 1632, once in an aristocratic library in Hungary, which may be significant, I don't know, is probably the earliest that I know of. I do not believe that it was bound in 1632, certainly, but it is the first binding this text block has ever received. But the binding, with its curiously decorated edges and secondary cover of glazed cream-colored paper, together with the stuck-on end bands, with a secondary sewing through parchment linings, argue for a date in the second half of the 17th century. And the cream glazed paper was used in imitation of the more expensive parchment. It was a cheaper way of producing a parchment-like cover, and well suited to an inexpensive adhesive case binding. The inside of the left board shows one of the coarse paper boards made from 3 laminations of cartonnage. The edge of the spine piece and the outer stub, to which the spine piece was first adhered, and then the boards. The head and tail ends of the outer stub were then torn away to allow for the secondary cover of cream-colored paper to be turned in across the joints. And this is a typical feature of many of these bindings. I hope that I've been able to show you with this example how careful you need to be when analyzing a binding, and secondly, how a thesaurus, an essential tool in the descriptive process, is only part of the answer, and that it is an understanding of how the components and features of a binding were used that will allow you to differentiate between very similar-looking bindings and allow them to be placed accurately within a general taxonomy of bindings. I believe, of course, that I am right in my conclusion that these bindings are genuine adhesive case bindings, but believing is not proof. That comes from a more general acceptance by others in the field, and I will look forward to hearing your views on this obscure subject. And thank you very much for listening.
So terminology and models to describe bindings in a univoc way. Are there any questions o domande, interventi? Prego, c'è una domanda qui davanti.
Anna Gialdini, Fondazione Bruno Kessler. Thank you so much, Nicholas, for a fascinating paper and very rich and very dense. I don't have an answer to your question, as you can imagine, but I do have another question for you. I was wondering whether we get any sense through primary sources, and especially maybe booksellers' catalogs or printers' catalogs, because we're moving towards a time period where we start getting that kind of source, or through any other primary sources, correspondences, people complaining or appreciating bindings, that booksellers or binders or their customers perceived a difference between these structures?
Yep. It's a very good question, and I spend a lot of time looking at bookseller catalogs, trying to read into the runes some meaning, and as we have heard from the Vatican Library, it is not easy, because the terminology used was the common terminology of the day, and they didn't need to explain it to each other. They knew what they meant by these very abbreviated terms. So you'll find paper boards, which can mean half a dozen different things. The same as in descriptions of bindings in pergameno. In pergameno can mean hundreds of different things. And they knew what they talked about. We don't know what they talked about. And these bindings, gebrochene Rücken is the old German term for them, but you'll very rarely, I think, see it in a bookseller's catalog or in a library catalog. You will find a description of the color of the paper, the decoration on the paper, marbled paper, whatever it may be, but that is usually all you find. As to whether it is a lace case or an adhesive case, there's complete silence. unfortunately. And I didn't put it into this lecture because I wanted to keep within my time limits, I hope I did, that you will find the same three-part structure with the spine piece and boards laced onto slips. So they are actually lace case and not adhesive case bindings. And that, to me, actually reinforces my argument that these are case bindings and that the three-piece is a case. It is not in boards. I think there is, to me at least, conclusive evidence, and that is part of it. But never, ever mentioned in a bookseller's catalog, because that information is hidden by the cover when the book is new. It's when it is damaged that you see it, and then you can start looking for it in undamaged examples and hopefully identify them. But no, the answer is, I don't think so.
Altre domande? No, profound silence, no. Altre domande? Any other questions? I have a question for you, Nicholas. When and why did you start to work on terminology of book binding?
Well, it started, and this actually is quite a significant question beyond what you're in meaning at first. You can only start to understand what is going on if you see thousands and thousands of books, because we are in a world which is filled with thousands and millions of books. We are in a room surrounded by books. We've got this medieval library behind me, and I'm sure many of you are looking longingly at that library and not listening to me rabbiting on about 19th century book structure. But this room is full of 18th and 19th century book structure, and these are books which were used and which were sold, bought and sold, all for many, many years. And I began to see these books when I was working for the National Trust, which owns many country houses around England, and many of these houses have libraries. And these libraries may be 20 books, they may be 20,000 books. And I was employed to do condition reports on the libraries. So I spent many, many very happy months in freezing cold libraries looking at every single book in every single library, which was handling around 35,000 books a year. And I began to see pictures forming in my mind. I've seen this before, I saw that there, and yes, that was on a German book too. And so you begin to build this up, and then you say, well, this one is made slightly differently from that one, and what is the difference? And then you have to have a terminology. I do lots and lots of drawings, but drawings are not terms, they are drawings. They're very useful, actually essential, to understand what you are describing, but eventually it has to go into words, and that is where the terminology became important, and I became incredibly frustrated by the lack of precision in terminology, particularly, and I don't know if we have representatives of the book trade in here, in the book trade, because the booksellers are notoriously inventive when it comes to the use of terminologies. I'm sure many of us have discovered. And the problem is that the bookseller descriptions very often get into the library catalogues because it's easier for the cataloger just to lift the description and put it into the catalogue. And so entirely erroneous descriptions come into play. You have the same term used to mean different things. You have different terms used to mean the same thing. And we had a conference in London many years ago now about the translation of the Musarel's terminology of manuscript studies. And the last day was on bookbinding, and it became perfectly obvious that Musarel, as he himself admitted, was not a bookbinding historian, and it just did not work as something to translate. So the answer was to start from scratch, and that's what we did. It took a very long time to get to where we are, but we now have, I think, a workable prototype, as it were, of a thesaurus, which can be and will be adapted as more and more is discovered. Thanks to Thanasis' design, we can do that.
Really interesting and useful, because the terminology from Legatus is widespread, is used in a wider way. So.
No, and it's very gratifying to see that the members of the book trade are now using the Legatus thesaurus terminology, which is very pleasing.
Analog the description of the book in all the language? How do you feel the translation or the terminology in all the language?
Well, we are, I don't think we even have a shoestring to run on. We are running on air at the moment, That is to say, we have a thesaurus, and it is looked after by a small international group of people who meet online 2 or 3 times a year to discuss further developments of the language, corrections, additions, and so on. And we have groups of people in most of the European countries who are working on translations. So we have Spanish, we have French, we have Italian, we have German, we have Dutch. I think we have Dutch, sort of, more or less. We have Norwegian, we have Lithuanian. And so we slowly are accumulating translations, and these, when they get to a point where it is feasible to put them online, will be put online. And the construction of the thesaurus allows us to do this, because the new terms go on as labels to the existing scope notes. So if the scope note has not been translated, at least if you look up the word in another language, you'll find a scope note in English which applies to that term. And as time goes on, we will have more translation done. Now, if anybody here knows a Maecenas who is waiting to pour money into our laps, we will work much more quickly. But until that point, we are left with a very loyal group of volunteers who are doing what they can under all the circumstances of having to earn a living at the same time. I am beyond that now, but I have other things to do too. So, that's it.
Thank you very much. Qualche altro intervento? Domande? Grazie. Allora, Nicholas Pickwoad. Thank you very much, Nicholas.